Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here this week with Dylan Robertson, who's a reporter with the Winnipeg Free Press, and he's been on the story of the National Microbiology Lab for pretty much the last 2 years now. So I figured we'd talk to him and dispel some of what's going on, because there's been a lot of talk about Chinese agents and attempts to tie the firing of these two scientists there to the investigation in the Wuhan lab in China around the origins of the COVID virus. And people are deliberately conflating the two in order to try and make a scene, which I think we should probably unpack. So Dylan, why don't I just get you to kind of start with what you found over your reporting?
Sure. So I thought I would maybe walk through the timeline of how this whole thing happened and then get into the post-pandemic, because that's when it really starts to take on the themes that you've talked about. Zhangguo Chu and Keting Chang are the two scientists. They were born in China. Chu is what everyone calls her. She's been in Canada since 1996. And this whole thing kind of dates back to a March 2019 shipment. It was Ebola and Hennepin viruses. Those are a biosecurity level 4. That's the highest kind of containment that you need for samples. And she sent those to the Wuhan lab. This came to light in July that they had been walked out by the RCMP. For full credit, it was Karen Pauls at CBC who broke the story.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we heard the same thing, but we really wanted some clarity on what happened. And we still don't really know what happened. So, what we had heard from the lab, I am reading off some notes here.
Okay.
The folks who work in special pathogens, that's the section that deals with a lot of these biosecurity for pathogens. They were basically saying that there was not a material transfer agreement that was signed, and FAC has disputed that.
Okay.
That's an agreement that part of it is intellectual property under the Budapest Treaty, but more so the concern is about liability. So you send samples so that people have something to work with. You kind of have to cover how are they going to store this, how are they going to use it, who's liable if people get sick.
Right.
Typically, that would include a lab leak. And what kind of technology can you do with this? One of the controversial things that sort of come up with the Wuhan lab is gain of function, which is when you are trying to modify a pathogen to make it more virulent or more deadly, you're trying to get a better understanding of how it works. But that's not really the kind of research we tend to do in Canada. So basically, the whole incident touches on a deeper issue, and that's been the focus of my reporting, which is kind of the morale at the lab and the allegations of favoritism. And they touch on Chu sort of in that she was the Ebola researcher. She won the Governor General's Prize. She was pretty liked at the lab. But there was also a perception that there might not have been as much scrutiny and supervision for certain people, herself included.
Okay.
So the allegation, like with the samples and not having an agreement, that's not something that everyone would necessarily get away with.
Right.
And I thought it would maybe just kind of get into the history of the lab without boring people here.
Okay.
Mulroney decided to put it in Winnipeg, and that was after the 1987 CFA team's pullout when they moved it to Montreal, which people in Winnipeg still talk about.
Yes, and for those of us who study a little bit about how this kind of was one of the flashpoints for the formation of the Reform Party, the West Wants In. That was one of the incidents that was kind of the touch point for that.
Totally. A way to kind of placate that sentiment was to put the lab there. And part of it is like there had been good biosecurity kind of industry in Winnipeg. This is a lab that's specifically meant for human and animal pathogens. There's a huge agricultural side that I don't think people tend to talk about. And so the thinking was to put it there because there's already a lot of the general kind of economic and weather kind of research on crops, on animals in the West. So the lab opens in 1999, and ever since then, it's kind of always had a bit of a mashing of heads over, you know, the Ottawa culture of red tape, of bureaucracy, of doing things by the book. And the Winnipeg version of like, we're scientists, we know what we're talking about. We work with our colleagues, whether they're in Canada or abroad. And, you know, that kind of had become an issue even with some of the transfers in the past.
Okay.
And this has been talked about. You know, Michael Garner, the former senior epidemiologist at FAC, kind of hints at it in his testimony a month or two ago to the Health Committee or the China Committee, you know, that the protocols weren't always necessarily followed. And that was just because the scientists felt like they knew what they were doing and they wanted Ottawa to get off their back. There was also a fair amount of, you know, dysfunction in the lab. And I think even just like the Ebola patent is a good example of that. It's the pride of Winnipeg that it was, you know, created in that lab. But then, you know, did it actually get used? Where did it go? Justin Ling has done some really good reporting on what exactly happened there, and part of that was known. And I would say like part of this kind of got worse in the 2014 reform to how FAC had worked. So David Butler-Jones was the top doctor at the time. There was a butting of heads with the Harvard government over ideological views of public health. The clearest example is the prison needle exchange that the government had canceled. The top doctor is the one who had ordered it. It was apparently, you know, bringing down STIs in prison, but it wasn't really a seller for the conservative government.
No, there was a whole thing about whether or not they actually believed in something like harm reduction, which I wrote a bunch of stories on at the time as well. So yeah, that's all bringing me back now to that era.
Actually, Dale did write a lot about this. I did see this a lot in the clippings when I was going through like how this whole thing happened. And I will get to the pandemic in a moment, but like that's also been a thorough line with Grant Robertson's investigations into the Global Public Health Information Network, that sort of having bureaucrats in charge, you know, instead of like an auditor general or officer of parliament type position, it really is the bureaucracy. And so you have senior leaders who have worked their way up. Sometimes they might be science adjacent. They might have worked at NRCan. But there's a criticism that came out in FAC's own internal report that they don't fully understand the science, the top leaders. And so the scientists are not always great communicators, and, you know, making their case about why this actually matters. Like why
I think we've had a few examples of that over the past couple of months.
I mean, yes. But also just making their case about why like the resources have to be here.
Yeah.
Whereas I get there's a democratic accountability side for sure. But you know, Dr. Tam, the criticism towards her, it's like, well, she's filling the job that she's supposed to fill here. Her job is not David Butler-Jones' job. And we saw that with the one before, Gregory Taylor, and the travel ban on Ebola countries. Like that seemed to be a fairly political kind of thing when the whole public health community at the time said this is not a productive way to sort of contain this pathogen, especially given that we had the travel ban in Toronto during SARS, and that wasn't cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm on a tangent. I'm going to go back to the lab.
Okay, yes.
There's been like an open question about what is the purpose of the lab. You know, it opens like right before 9/11, and then after that it becomes about anthrax. And by the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, these are the folks who are going to bring a truck to check athletes for anthrax attacks. And it kind of morphs into Ebola. It's obviously that's not the only focus. Like it does set standards for labs across the country. It is like the CDC in Atlanta. It does a lot of global collaboration. It's really helping us right now with genomic sequencing and setting the standards and making sure that, like, you know, we didn't have a disaster like the CDC in the States where there was like contaminated tests that the states didn't know how to use because the federal one got messed up.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this impacts who gets promoted, how they get promoted, who gets to deploy. That's one of the big things. You know, do I get to go to different labs in Canada? Do I get to go to the front lines of Ebola in West Africa? Like, they do a lot of these deployments, but not everyone gets to go, because it might be, who are you friends with at the lab? It might be, do you fit the narrow kind of vision for the lab? Like, the lab is not clear on what it's actually supposed to do. Even like, people say, why didn't they come up with a vaccine for COVID? And it's like, well, a vaccine for a novel coronavirus is not really in the wheelhouse right now for how the lab envisions itself. It's really there in case we get something crazy coming out like MERS. You know, the coronavirus known in South Korea and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of research on MERS, which, to get to the pandemic, you know, like, the idea that the lab is somehow involved in, you know, coronavirus or a gain-of-function disease related to SARS-CoV-2, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for it.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of the things that I've been trying to push back in my own kind of columns and so on in the last few weeks, is just, you know, there's no real causal link that we can find between what happened in Winnipeg and Wuhan.
Yeah, like, what we know, like, Chu had gone to the Wuhan lab quite a few times, and at one point that was denied. We know that the lab does gain a function, and we have found out through the Globe the nature of this whole thing, because the RCMP, maybe it was a bit obvious. I mean, the RCMP wouldn't be investigating unless it was the Federal Policing Division, which would lean more towards national security. It wasn't the Winnipeg Police from the get-go.
Right.
It wasn't, you know, D Division that seemed to be in charge of this whole thing. But it was really after the Globe had broke the story that it was CSIS that tipped them off. And then, you know, more recently, just looking at the role of military scientists working at the lab, Chinese military scientists, which that was out there if you knew to look for it or if you thought about it. It goes back to what NRCan has talked about. It goes back to Dick Fadden when he didn't say the word China, but he said, you know, certain countries. You know, at that point, the government, like, this month, basically started talking about a national security reason. And we really hadn't heard that before. And I think part of that is the pressure that they're getting in Parliament to produce more documents, because, you know, like, Michelle Rempel-Garner has raised the MTA issue, the Material Transfer Agreement. She actually has done some work in related fields. But the focus has really been around the Wuhan lab. And I don't know the full story. I'm sure when documents come out in court or to the committee, you'll see my typo emails and weird stuff. But you know, I don't really feel comfortable weighing in on it. But at the moment, there's not a lot of evidence for that. And you know, I think a lot of the people at the lab feel Chu wasn't a perfect person, but she was respected. And just the whole kind of vacuum that it left. It was already bad enough in July 2019 when the story came out about Chinese researchers, and we don't actually know, like, their citizenship. I mean, I'm sure both of them probably are Chinese citizens. But
I've actually read in, I think it was Canadian Press, that they were both Canadian citizens.
I wouldn't be surprised. So I'm sure they must have PR or something. It just, the framing of it as, you know, having these sketchy researchers that U of M allowed, the University of Manitoba students who came from China, you know, there was a foreign element in this whole thing, but a lot of people at the lab have been pretty distraught because it's, you know, once you go below the upper management, and even within the upper management, it's really perceived to be the toxic workplace issue. This is what the internal reviews have done, whether we've got them through ATIP, through briefing notes, through leaks, through the union. Like, they're saying, like, this has a lot of problems with the work culture. And, like, part of that, as a side note, is just the intensity of working in the science lab.
Yeah.
but the perception that this is, you know, someone who is out to hurt Canada, I don't have evidence of that. I don't know if that's the case. To get to your point, you know, we do see this come up at the China committee, and we do see a lot of talk about the theory of a lab leak. And that theory has not been entirely discounted at this point. But the link with Winnipeg is really not clear. It almost seems like the deeper issue of Dick Fadden talking about China like a decade ago at this point, and like not having that reckoning, and now with the two Michaels and the Globe kind of pushing that discussion that I think we really haven't had the way Australia has. You have these side things where this conspiracy theory just takes on so much weight, and it makes it, I guess, in a way kind of difficult when you're trying to compel the documents and the leveraging of that narrative. Yeah, I think I'll stop.
Yeah, and I would also just kind of say as well that, you know, the minister herself has not done this any favors in the kind of rote talking points that she's giving about the Winnipeg lab is a national crown jewel, and just saying these two scientists are no longer employed, so we can't talk about it, and not really providing any context or anything that would help to just dispel some of the conspiracy theorism. And it just, not saying anything just kind of makes it even worse. And so this is kind of why, you know, I wanted to just have this conversation with you, because I've read your stories on it. And I've read, you know, like when basically you've seen the internal emails that describe this as an intellectual property breach. And then having that contrasted to people trying to compare this to the origins of COVID in the Wuhan lab. And I think, you know, we just need to kind of get a better perspective on what it is we're actually talking about with what happened.
Yeah, like I'll read one thing. I won't pull up a lot, but, you know, this email that I quoted in the story way back last fall, or I guess fall 2019, you know, this July 17th email from the union at the shipping bay. Any processes our members performed at the request of Chu or Cheng were done as per the standard operating procedures, and with the understanding that this was received or shipped, or sorry, what was received or shipped was recorded in the transportation documentation. There was no requirement to examine or verify the identity of the specimen shipped or received. And then she said, you know, the union needs to be made aware if staff are questioned in advance about, quote, any duplicity by Chu or Cheng. So, you know, this is a July 17th message. It relates to a March 2019 sample. We know the coronavirus, you know, appears in November or December of that year. Does that mean they shipped a coronavirus that was related? I'm not seeing the link here, given the type of pathogens that they tend to work with. And I'd have to go back and check, but I'm actually not even confident that SARS-CoV-2 is a 4 level biosecurity anyway. Zika is 2.
I don't believe it is either. And yeah, just going back, like the one researcher there, you know, her field was Ebola. She came up with the vaccine. So it doesn't track that anything like this would have to do with a coronavirus.
I mean, it was a little bit more, like, was Marburg was her big one, probably more so than Ebola. And like those do have respiratory implications, but like, yeah, like this was not a coronavirus specialist. I'm not sure if there are any at the lab. I'm sure they've worked with those sorts of things, but the focus on SARS-1 seems to have abated pretty quickly afterwards. And I think that goes back to the question about what is this lab actually for?
Yeah.
I think, and I have to agree with you. I mean, just like the lack of clarity, and I'm surprised that they wouldn't even, you know, leak some reason, even though that's not the most transparent way, that they would at least just put out the government side about what they see this thing really coming from, because instead it's kind of stewed and created all this sort of whispers and this like fairly racially charged sort of what's the word, like implication, and people at the lab talk. They're still talking. They talk to me. They talk to Karen Pauls. They talk to the Globe. This stuff just keeps, it's like a constant like drip, drip, drip. And just the fact that you have that many people talking is kind of alarming when it's a high security lab from the get-go. Like what does that tell you about the work culture?
Yeah.
The unions keep saying it's really bad. It's still really bad. And FACT says it's going great. Great work culture. We've really
yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this, Dylan. I really appreciate your walking us through this and giving us a better picture of what actually went on, so that we're a little more informed as we're hearing all this stuff being kind of bandied around in the House of Commons and in the media. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks. I think I just complicated it more, but I was happy to chat with you.
All right. Thanks.
Great. See ya.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.